Hello, Abdulgani Shehu here from yourcontentmart.co. In today's video, I want to share how Zencastr could use SEO to acquire user signups. So, first and foremost, what is Zencastr? So, Zencastr is an all-in-one podcasting platform. So, what this means is that with Zencastr, you can record, you can edit, um, you can host, you can monetize your podcast. So like anything related to podcasting, you can do it on Zencastr. And Zencastr has been around for a while. They were founded in 2015, and currently Zencastr has about 30,000 users. And when it comes to podcasting, the podcasting industry, so Zencastr is one of the dominant players in the industry. So as you can see from the screen here, so this is the homepage of Zencastr. So as you can see, you can use it to record, you can use it to produce, you can use it to host, you can use it to analyze, and also to monetize a podcast. So everything related to podcasting, you can do it like on the Zencastr platform. So now let's delve into like the SEO part. So is Zencastr doing well SEO wise? So the first thing, as you can see from the screen here, is that Zencastr has a strong brand. So for instance, like about more than about 10,000 persons are searching for Zencastr on Google. So what that means is that Zencastr has a brand that people already know. Okay, so when it comes to like the podcast, like when someone is looking for a podcast tool or platform to use, Zencastr is one of those like platforms that most people use and they know. So Zencastr has a brand, a strong brand, I must say. But one thing I observed from my research is that when you look at the Zencastr, if you do a site-wide search for the brand on Google, so you see that like their Zencastr isn't really doing anything like as far as SEO is concerned. So even though they have a very strong brand, but when you look at most of the pages that are on Google, you see that a lot of them are like all these auto-generated pages from their users who are hosting their podcasts on Zencastr. So they aren't really doing anything as far as SEO is concerned, despite the fact that they have a strong brand. So, and to buttress this fast, you can see it from SEMrush. So this is SEMrush. So you can see that according to SEMrush, Zencastr is ranking for over 4,000 keywords. They are getting about 11,000, about 12,000 organic traffic visitors, and the traffic cost is about 133,000. So, but the most important part of this detail is this branded and non-branded traffic. So you can see that the branded traffic for Zencastr is about 11,200, and the non-branded traffic is just 768. So what means is that most of the people that are using Zencastr, like they are people that actually found, they actually know the brand. So they've been like, they know the brand, and that's how they find it on Google. So there are people that are just doing branded search, maybe Zencastr, Zencastr login, Zencastr podcast platform, and all those things like that. So also like to show that Zencastr has a strong SEO brand. So you can see here, according to SEMrush, they have over 17,000 referring domains, and they have over 2 million backlinks. So, and you can see the authority score according to SEMrush is 41. So you can see that like when it comes to SEO, like Zencastr actually has a strong domain authority. They have a strong brand. They have a strong foundation. So, but the problem is that they are not utilizing this so in any way to grow their startup. So now let's now moving forward. Let's talk about How can Zencastr use SEO to grow organic traffic and acquire users? And so there are three recommendations I have for the Zencastr team. Now, the first recommendation is that they could start by building free tools. So that is the first recommendation. So there are a lot of tools that Zencastr as an all-in-one podcasting platform could build for their users for free. So now let me make some recommendations. So the first one here, you can see podcast name generator. So you can see here that a lot of people, according to keywords everywhere, about 9,900 and 900 persons or 10,000 persons are searching for this keyword every month. So like someone that just wants to start a podcast and they want to name their podcast, so they could be searching for podcast name generator. So from here, probably the person don't know about Zencastr, and that could be a good way to position Zencastr as a platform whereby they can even record, edit, host, and monetize their podcast. So that's the first one. So another recommendation I have here is one of the keywords they could target: podcast episode title generator. So like someone has already created a podcast, do they want to generate a title for the episode? So they could be searching for this on Google. So this is one of the free tools that Zencastr could build. Another one is podcast description generator. So podcast description generator, like someone that wants to generate a description for their podcast. So they don't want to stress themselves. And of course, we have AI these days. So Zencastr could build an AI tool that helps um, anyone that has a podcast to generate their podcast description for free. Another one is podcast revenue collector calculator. So because Zencastr also helps with monetizing a podcast, so they could have these target this keyword podcast revenue calculator, build a calculator that helps you to calculate the amount you could make from your podcast depending on the number of plays you have, downloads, and how long you've been running your podcast, the number of episodes, and so on. So that's another one. Another one here, which is the final recommendation for the free tools, is podcast cover art maker. So someone wants to start a podcast and they want to create a cover art for their podcast. So Zencastr could build this tool, a podcast cover art maker, like for free, and which could help them to get people that are already starting a podcast. So they want to design a cover art, and from there they could know about Zencastr and all the features that the platform has. So that's the first recommendation. So Zencastr could consider building free tools, so that will help them to capture problem aware prospects. So another one is which is one of the top recommendations, is they could target alternatives and top competitors comparison posts. So Zencastr is actually competing with a lot of tools in the podcasting industry. So as you can see from this keyword I just inputted on Google here, so Zencastr versus, so like a lot of people are searching for Zencastr versus Riverside versus Quadcast versus Zoom, StreamYard, Anchor, Buzzsprout, Audacity, and so on. So like there are a lot of, they could do a lot of researches regarding this to identify all the competitors that people are comparing Zencastr against, and they could create competitor pages and alternative pages to rank for these keywords. So another one is alternative. So like creating competitor pages, comparing one competitor against the other. So for instance, Riverside is one of the top Zencastr competitors. So they could create pages targeting Riverside versus StreamYard versus Quadcast versus Descript and so on. So also they could like also do something like, since let's say Descript is one of their competitors, so Descript versus, so they could do that. But for Descript, because Descript has a lot of tools, especially for video editing, but they're also good for podcasts. And so they could focus on those competitors. For instance, Vid. So Vid also has other video editing features, but there are people are now using it for podcasting. So they could target something like Descript versus Vid. Discrete versus Riverside, and so on. So they could also something like Squadcast. So I think Squadcast was recently acquired by Descript. So, but they could still target some of these keywords like Squadcast versus Riverside, Squadcast versus StreamYard, Squadcast versus Zencastr. So you can see like, and so Squadcast versus Zoom, and so on and so forth. So that's another way to go about alternative and comparison posts. And the third part, which is the final one, is to create alternatives itself. So, for instance, someone might be searching for Riverside alternatives. So, another person might be searching for Descript alternatives. Okay. Another person might be searching for maybe something like Descript alternatives for, okay, nothing like that. Okay, so but the script alternatives, I'm quite sure that people are searching for it, and maybe someone else might be searching for castors. So castors is one of their competitors. So castors alternatives, if I'm not mistaken. So Castors is also a competitor to Zencastr. So and so on and so forth. So all these alternatives that we mentioned, Zoom alternatives. So, but in the case of Zoom, maybe something like Zoom alternatives for podcasting or something like that. So those are some of the keywords, like the kind of topics they could build as far as ranking for alternative and alternative and comparison posts. So, and the final part is they could strategically create jobs to be done and pinpoint related listicles. So, this will help them to capture um, their users wherever they are. So, for instance, because Zencaster has a lot of features, so Zencaster can be used for hosting. So, they could targets hosting, podcast hosting related keywords, something like podcast hosting platforms, podcast hosting software. So that could also be it. Podcast hosting, best podcast hosting software, podcast hosting for Spotify for free, best podcast hosting or podcast hosting software, podcast hosting software for, okay, maybe something like that. So like just keywords related to podcast hosting. So podcast hosting tools, podcast hosting platform, podcast hosting platform comparison, and so on. So keywords that are related to podcast hosting that will work well for them. Another one is podcast recording. So Zencastr also helps you to record your podcast. So maybe something like podcast recording software, podcast recording app, podcast recording tool, tools, free podcast recording tool, um, uh, podcast recording software. Okay, for okay, so you can see this. So podcast recording software for Mac, for beginners, for Windows 10, with video, podcast recording software with video, podcast recording app for iPhone, podcast recording app for Windows. So like these are variations that they could target as far as podcast recording software. Another one is podcast monetization. So because Zencaster is a podcast monetization platform, so maybe something like podcast monetization platform, podcast advertising platform, podcast monetization platform for, okay, best podcast platform for monetization. Still the same thing. How do you monetize a podcast? How to start and monetize a podcast? So like these are variations of the keyword for podcast monetization. So they could still do in-depth research to identify more keywords like that. Another one is how to start a podcast. So maybe someone that want to start a podcast, like they will be searching for something like how to start a podcast on Spotify, on YouTube, how to start a podcast on Apple, how to start a podcast for beginners, like, and so on, how to start a podcast with no audience. So these are keywords that Zencaster could target related to how to start a podcast, and also how to record a podcast. So because it is a platform for podcast recording, so someone might be searching for how to record a podcast for free over Zoom, how to record a podcast over Zoom, how to record a podcast on your phone, how to record a podcast on Discord, how to record a podcast on Mac. So these are like shows that people have these pain points, so they want to know how they could record the podcast. So these are keywords or topics that Zencaster could target to help their users with these to solve these problems. And also, finally, podcast equipment. So there are lots of them, but let me stop at this. So podcast equipment. So someone that wants to start a podcast is probably looking for a podcast equipment. So something like podcast equipment bundle, podcast equipment for beginners, podcast equipment for two, podcast equipment for four, and podcast equipment kits. So maybe something like also best podcast equipment. Okay, something like best starter podcast equipment, best affordable podcast equipment, best video podcast equipment, best inexpensive like there are a lot of them like that. So these are some of the keywords that Zencaster could target to strategically like capture prospects wherever they are. So like that is it for today's video. So as I said, like to summarize, so the three things that Zencaster could do, even though there are more, but the three recommendations they could actually implement now to acquire user signups from SEO. So the first one is to build free tools that will help them to capture problem aware prospects. Secondly, they could target alternatives and top competitors comparison posts that will help them to capture solution aware prospects. And finally, they could strategically create jobs to be done and pain point related listicles and how to content. So that will help them to capture prospects wherever they are. So I hope you find this video valuable and helpful. If you do, let me know what you think about it. And until next time, do have a great day ahead. Bye.